So good evening, everyone. It's very nice to see so many familiar faces, and I know we have a lot of people watching via live stream as well, and so welcome to everyone out there in the cyber universe. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is James Herbert. I'm the president of the University of New England, and I welcome you all to tonight's President's Forum event. First of all, I would just point out to everyone, I appreciate you wearing your mask. It is UNE policy that we wear masks inside. We do make some exceptions, including events like tonight, and the guests who are all vaccinated have agreed that they will be maskless on stage. But please continue to join me in wearing masks when we're sitting in the audience. So, we're witnessing a breakdown of discourse in society. This is fed by the 24-hour cable news media and social media with all of the algorithms that insulate us into our own little ideological self-proclaimed bubbles. This has led to political polarization across our country and, unfortunately, to ideological orthodoxies on both the left and the right that embrace a sort of crude tribalism in lieu of data and careful reasoning. The consequence of all of this is the art of discourse, which is so vital to the functioning not only of a democracy, but of the pursuit of truth, has broken down, and it's rapidly disappearing. I believe that universities have a special obligation to foster such discourse. This has been the case since the very beginning, since the founding of Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum in the 4th century BC, as well as the founding of the first modern university in Genoa in 1088. Public discourse has always been at the heart of the raison d'etre of universities, and we need to be a place that continues to foster that kind of robust yet civil discourse. This is also a high priority for me personally. As some of you may know, I've given a TED Talk on this very topic, I've written op-eds on it, and I think it's very important that we do whatever we can within the university to foster such discourse. When I arrived at UNE about 4.5 years ago, I decided to build on programs that were already in place at the institution by creating this event called the President's Forum. And the idea is that the goals of the forum are twofold. First is to foster deep discussion and exploration of an important and timely topic from different perspectives. And the second is to model the art of productive conversation, robust conversation, but in a civil and respectful way. And this evening, we're going to be doing that and discussing a topic that is as important, if not more, than any other in our day right now, which is the topic of policing in America. This is a topic that's long been vitally important, but it's become even more so over the past, say, year, 18 months, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police officers. This topic is arguably one of the most urgent of our times. The discussion is also especially timely here at UNE because we are in the process right now of creating a new academic major in criminology that will debut in our College of Arts and Sciences this coming fall. There's a wide range of perspectives on policing in our country, everything from knee-jerk defensiveness of the status quo to calls for various kinds of police reform within the existing framework to the abolition of policing altogether as we know it. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome to UNE two leading scholars on this topic, Dr. Neil Gross of Colby College and Dr. Brendan McQuade of the University of Southern Maine. Professor Gross is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Sociology at Colby. He is a former police officer who taught previously at Princeton, the University of British Columbia, Harvard, and the University of Southern California. Until recently, when he turned toward the study of law enforcement, he worked primarily on sociological theory and the sociology of intellectual life. His articles have been published in the American Sociological Review and Annual Review of Sociology, Sociological Theory, Theory and Society, and the New York Times. Professor McQuade is an assistant professor of criminology at the University of Southern Maine. He previously taught at DePaul University in the International Studies Department and at SUNY Cortland in the Sociology and Anthropology Department. He is the author of Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence, Fusion, and Mass Surveillance, which earned a Paul Sweezy Marxist Sociology Book Award. His areas of interest include historical sociology, state theory, the critique of security, and social movements. Gentlemen, thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening. And tonight's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Anwar Majid. Dr. Majid is professor of English at UNE, who also serves as our vice president for global affairs and the director of our Center for Global Humanities. He's also the director of our campus in Tangier, Morocco. Dr. Majid has published widely on relations between Islam and the West and is a vocal advocate for dialogue across cultures. And in that respect, I think he's especially appropriate to facilitate tonight's conversation. So I'd like to thank not only our special guests, but the many UNE students, faculty, professional staff, and trustees, as well as community members who are in attendance tonight. And I also would like, once again, to welcome those joining us via live stream. And last but not least, I'm very grateful to the many people at UNE and our communications and facilities teams in particular who helped with the logistics in making this event possible. So, without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to Anwar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. So I have a folder here with a few notes, notes from some of the writings of, I'm going to call them by their first names if you don't mind, Neil and Brendan, and then notes from some other works from the 18th and 19th century toward the end of the conversation. Probably we'll get to them. But for now, we're going to make it very quick. We're going to keep it very engaging to the audience. And my hope also is to have the audience engage at some point with questions and so on and so forth. So without further ado, Neil.
Well, thank you so much, and Professor Herbert, I want to thank you for inviting me to this event, and to everyone here for organizing it. Thank you, and Brendan, I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I want to begin by issuing a caveat, which is that I'm not a criminologist, nor am I a scholar who's spent his whole career studying the police. As President Herbert noted, actually most of my career has been spent studying things that are very far removed from policing. My first book was a biography of a philosopher, and my second book was a kind of data-heavy study that looked at the politics of professors. But I have an unusual background in that before I went to graduate school, I worked briefly in law enforcement. I was a police officer for about 11 months, very short time, after the academy in the city of Berkeley, California. And I'd worked in a kind of part-time capacity, non-sworn, for several police departments while I was in college. Always thought that was going to be my career, and did it for 11 months and realized that it wasn't quite for me. When I applied to graduate school, I thought I'd become a policing scholar. That was my goal. But life took a different turn, and that was the case until about 6 years ago when I moved to Colby College, when I started teaching a class called Policing the American City, a small seminar. And that's renewed my interest in this subject. Since that time, I've been doing pretty extensive research in the area. I'm working on a book currently about police reform that looks at cities that have successfully engaged in reform efforts. And now I spend most of my time when I'm not teaching, writing and thinking about policing and calling and texting with cops around the country. So I feel reasonably steeped in the topic, but again, I'm not a criminologist by training. So we agreed to keep our opening statements to 5 minutes, and I'll do that. And my plan for doing so is to simply start with a quotation. So when I went to graduate school, I chose the University of Wisconsin because there was a scholar teaching there in the law school who I admired greatly, a guy named Herman Goldstein. Those of you who have any knowledge of policing, Goldstein was very well known in the 80s and 90s as the advocate of something called problem-oriented policing, which was the idea that the police should stop being simply responders to 911 calls, and they should rather partner with people in the community to proactively solve problems that might arise on their beat. But Goldstein, who's the very first person I took a class from in graduate school, actually had a broader perspective on law enforcement than this. And a book that he wrote in 1977 was actually quite formative to me. And I want to read a quotation from that book that to me speaks to the issue, the position that I'll try to defend tonight. On the very first page of that book, Goldstein wrote, quote, "The strength of a democracy and the quality of life enjoyed by its citizens are determined in large measure by the ability of the police to discharge their duties." The strength of a democracy and the quality of life enjoyed by its citizens are determined in large measure by the ability of the police to discharge their duties. Let me take a second to unpack that. I'll go backwards in order. First, quality of life determined by the ability of the police to discharge their duties. In some basic sense, with no disrespect to Herman Goldstein, who passed away recently, I think this is an overstatement. People's quality of life is determined by many, many factors. Sociologists would say it's determined by the structure of their society, by how well it functions, by their place in that society, by their social relationships, by their connections to other people, by their health and access to food and resources, those kinds of things. So is quality of life determined in some large measure by what the police do? No. But in a sense that any reader of Thomas Hobbes would recognize, any reader who recognizes that we ideally have a government in part so that life is not for us nasty, brutish, and short, for any such reader, you would recognize that it's difficult for people to fully enjoy the qualities of life if they are worried about being physically attacked or having their personal items stolen from them. Now, the police aren't the only institution that helps to assure public order, public safety. That's certainly true. But Goldstein argued correctly, in my view, that they are a vital institution in that regard. And so if they're not in a position to discharge their duties, citizens may not be able to enjoy their quality of life. Maybe we could rephrase Goldstein's quote, at least that part of it, by saying the quality of life of citizens is contingent, not determined by, but contingent on the ability of the police to discharge their duties. On the other side, the strength of a democracy. The strength of a democracy. Oh, I'll be short.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you. I'll just say Goldstein meant two things here. First of all, without armed agents of the state able to protect the basic institutions of a democracy, a nation is imperiled. See January 6th. On the other side, when the police fail to follow the law, people's liberties are infringed. Their free speech rights are trammeled. Their rights to be treated equally are undermined. Their rights to go where they please are challenged. And so Goldstein concluded, in a democracy that aspires to provide for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the police are an essential institution. And it's essential that they do their job and do it well. And that means they have to be effective. And it means that they have to zealously safeguard people's democratic freedoms. Goldstein thought in the 70s that the police had improved relative to where they'd been, but that they had a long way to go. And my position is that they have continued to improve, and they continue to have a long way to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Brendan?
Hello, everyone. Thank you to UNE President James Herbert for inviting me to this forum on policing. I'm here today to make the case for police abolition. I have 3 opening points. First, the discretionary nature of police makes them very difficult to reform. The essence of police power is not violence, but discretion, the ability to decide whether or not to use violence in any conceivable situation. Consider the most basic police interaction, the stop. The reasons for it have never been clear. Walking too fast, walking too slowly, being stationary are all grounds for a stop, and all have been used unfairly and unequally. The courts have always refused to define discretion because to define discretion would be to limit discretion. This isn't just an individual matter, it's institutional. The courts won't tell police they can't drop a bomb on a house as they did in Philadelphia in 1985, or use a robot to kill an active shooter with a bomb as they did in Dallas in 2016, or use lethal force against an autistic man having a mental health crisis as they did in Augusta last month. The courts can't tell police ahead of time what is reasonable or necessary, since all situations are always and forever unpredictable. So what is police? Discretion, or the expression of state power as an executive prerogative to act as seen fit. Second, the discretionary nature of police power means that police do not enforce the law and are not accountable to it. Police handle the law after the fact to justify the way they decided to restore order. Law is based on a liberal conception of society composed of free, self-governing individuals. The exercise of state power is legitimated through the rule of law, which respects individual rights. Police power, however, is based on a classical conception of society as a household with the state as the master. The defining characteristic of police power is the discretionary and virtually limitless power of the householder over its household. The police then do not deal with the law, they deal with threats. In theory, Dustin Paradis, the autistic man killed by the Augusta police last month, had rights under the law, but responding officers saw him as a threat. The law allowed the officers to murder Paradis. Even if the DA or courts find the officers guilty, the law still allowed them to have the prerogative to kill Paradis in the first place. This is tyranny, and it's built into what the philosopher Mark Neoclaus calls the permissive structure of the law. The law will never hold police accountable because police are not meant to be accountable to the law or enforce it. Police is a patriarchal power to manage people and things in the name of good order. This is why abolition is the only logical response to police. When you have a power that is designed to be unaccountable and has been unaccountable for so long, the reforms that stick to it only make it stronger and more efficient as they cover it in a veneer of legitimacy. 3, policing is order maintenance, but what kind of order? Most accounts of policing begin in the 19th century with the first uniformed public police departments, but the word has a longer and incredibly revealing history. The term police was first used in 15th century Europe. At this time, policing meant what we'd now call policy. It encompassed welfare, workforce development, urban planning, sanitation, and of course, what we now understand to be policing. The 15th century was also the beginning of what historians call the early modern period, an extended epoch of systems transition when the modern order of things was still being consolidated and older ways of living were still being systematically destroyed. The plebs and the proles and the working class in the making were entangled in both the market economy and the vestiges of pre-capitalist economies centered on the commons, which went beyond shared property, the commons, and entailed shared knowledge in the communal organization of social life. The idea of police then organized a violent intervention of the state to transform the commons into private property, uproot people from the land, and reorganize life around private property and the market. Police power is thus the patriarchal discretion of the head of household applied to the problems of the city, or the polis, the Greek word for city and the root of both police and policy. While the meaning of the word police has changed over the centuries, the basic nature of police power has not. The police are not here to protect you. They are here to protect the order of private property and the continued accumulation of private wealth. So for this reason, we need abolition, and we need it now. What does this mean? Reduce police budgets to by 50 to 80%. Narrow the mission of police departments to the investigation of reported crimes. Create non-police alternatives for so-called problems of public order connected to issues like drug use and mental health. Recreate the commons to work towards a social order based on cooperation, not conflict, based on meeting human needs, not advancing the endless and infinite accumulation of private wealth. So this begins with a social democratic common sense, a universal right to housing, healthcare, livelihood, or employment. But it doesn't end there. The renowned abolitionist Miriam Kaba often says defunding the police is the floor. To this, I will add the ceiling is communism. And by that, I do not mean 20th century state socialism, but the communism of the commons, a world of decentralized communal life where we work together to meet everyone's needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I was reading an article recently by Annie Lowry in The Atlantic, And she's saying that at all levels of government in the United States, the nation spends roughly double on police, prisons, and courts than what it spends on food stamps, welfare, and income supplements. At the federal level, a lot more is spent on defense than on education. So this is just a kind of follow-up remark to your statement, but I would invite both of you to respond to this or to comment on this, this fact. I'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, the United States does spend quite a bit on police and prisons. The real discrepancy there with respect to a comparison with other countries is on prisons. In fact, our police spending is largely comparable to that of other wealthy democracies. The number of police officers we have per capita is right around in the middle of the pack as compared to other wealthy democracies. So I would certainly agree that we need to scale back prisons. I think that mass incarceration has been an incredibly damaging and unhealthy turn in the history of our country. But I don't think that means necessarily scaling back policing, certainly to the extent that Brendan would advocate.
Okay. Brendan?
So when I think of issues like this, I think of a concept from a body of literature called The Political Economy of Punishment. And it's kind of an obscure concept. It originally was put forward by Jeremy Bentham in debates over poor relief in the UK. And the term is called the principle of less eligibility. And the idea is that the lowest position in the labor market sets the upper limit for social policy. So when we compare different outcomes of between countries, whether it be police violence or incarceration rates, it's not just police spending or prison spending that matters, right? It is social spending and the condition of the labor market, right? So in comparative social science, right, the United States is often considered to be one of the most extreme examples of a liberal market economy, right? In other words, our labor market is extremely unregulated in comparison to similarly developed and wealthy countries, right? And in my perspective, this is why the United States has such a shockingly high rate of police violence, such a high rate of incarceration, right? The lower the condition of the lowest level of the labor market is very poor here, and it sets a very low upper limit for social policy.
Thank you. Neil, in your op-ed for the New York Times in September 8, 2020, or you said you're talking about black drivers and so on. You said studies carried out over many years show that black drivers are stopped disproportionately, a gap that cannot be accounted for by factors like differential driving behavior or greater poverty, which might translate into more cars on the road with equipment violations. Research also suggests that when black drivers are pulled over, they tend to be treated less respectfully by the police and are given less leniency. And everything I've read, and I'm just trying to catch up, to get a sense before I moderated this debate, seems to suggest that to make a direct link between policing in America and slave patrols in the early colonial days of the Republic, or before the Republic even was founded.
Sure. So I feel like there are a number of issues still on the table that are left unaddressed, and so maybe I'll take a second to respond to some of Brendan's claims, and then I'll come back to this, which I think is really important. I'll just say just briefly on the history piece. I think you're right. If you look at the history of policing in this country, certainly as it was taught to me in the academy, there's one history, and then the social history of the policing is actually quite different. In the academy, you're taught that that policing originated in modern policing, at least as it influenced what happened in the U.S. It developed in England in the 19th century, in London, and then that model kind of spread to the U.S. and and spread all over the country from there. The actual history of the police is much more complicated, and it's actually quite multifaceted. So you're right that in a number of southern cities, Charleston, Savannah, for example, policing did start out as slave patrols, which had the dual purpose of catching runaway enslaved peoples and also quelling slave rebellions. So the history of policing in the South does kind of evolve from that route. In the North, the history is different. It is much more influenced by developments in England, and very closely connected to patterns of urban disorder that were arising in the 19th century. In the West, the pattern's different. So policing's evolved in a kind of amalgam, although policing evolved in different ways in different countries, all roughly around the same time, basically corresponding to a period of significant urbanization in the 19th century. But I want to come back just briefly to this discretion point that Brendan raised at the beginning, which I have to say I don't fully understand. I mean, I certainly understand the idea of discretion, right? So policing scholars have always noted that discretion is a key feature of policing, and it has to do with the basic enforcement of the law, right? So that is to say, both the law itself and the policies that police officers have to enforce require interpretation and judgment. So should a police officer ticket you if you're going 2 miles over the speed limit, 3 miles over the speed limit? How loud should a radio be before she or he asks you to turn down that radio for violating a city ordinance? There is a question of judgment that's involved. That's true not just of police, it's also true at some level of decisions that juries make and judges make. It is in the nature of law that it is to some extent an interpretive enterprise. That doesn't mean that enterprise is unconstrained by policy, by common law, by statute. It's in fact deeply constrained. And there are questions certainly about how much discretion police should have and whether that discretion should be peeled back and whether we can shape it in ways other than through policy. But I don't quite understand the point that because the enterprise involves discretion, it should be done away with. It doesn't register for me.
Brendan, thank you so much for the comment. I was able to go through your book very quickly and take some notes. And so I'm going to quote a passage from the book, and to give a sense of the kind of society we're talking about, the context of this discussion. You say the 1.5 million caged in prisons must be considered in relation to the larger criminalized population. And in your book, you talk about surplus populations and how to manage them. We'll get to that later. The 4.6 million people on probation and parole, the 12 million people more that spend some time in a county jail each year, and nearly 20 million people estimated to have a felony conviction. The criminalized mass of people is 9 times larger than the prison population. 2/3 of this group are poor, and 1/3 is black. An even larger group, 100 million, have some kind of criminal record, which as a result of electronic background checks and reporting requirements on applications leads to systemic discrimination in housing, employment, and education. Altogether, 1/3 of adults in the United States are entangled in the criminal legal system in some way. And then you say one more thing, many of the 100 million people with some kind of criminal record have never been imprisoned or under community supervision, but all of them are entered into the law enforcement databases that provide much of the raw data for intelligence fusion. And so by just very quickly, in his book, he talks about these fusion centers where a lot of data is collected and for surveillance and tracking purposes. So go ahead, Brendan. What do you make of this fact? I mean, this is a staggering fact of like this 1/3 of the adult population of the United States has some kind of criminal record.
Well, I mean, for me, I see this as as an outcome of the particular nature of development in the United States, right? So, in general terms, right, what we can call capitalism, right, is an order based on, infinite and endless change, right? Progress is the nice way to put it, right? Progress, development, right? But what that means is we live in a society based on, systemic insecurity, right? That necessitates a politics of security, right? So in the United States, in comparison to we'll say European countries, we have an overdeveloped, penal and police apparatus, and a underdeveloped, social wage, an underdeveloped welfare state. So, in European countries, they have the gentle, soft social policing of social service agencies. In the United States, we deal with this systemic insecurity after the fact, after harms have been committed, after harms have occurred, through police and prisons and courts. So the stats that you read off are, they're a reflection of the long afterlife of mass incarceration, right? There's nearly 2 million people in prisons and jails right now, but that kind of doesn't capture the full magnitude of the issue, right? Every year, 600,000 people, that's the entire city of Boston, leave the prison, right? 3/5 of them return to the prison within 5 years, right? So we have, we govern through mass criminalization. We deal with problems of poverty, of interpersonal harm, of every conceivable social problem. We deal with it primarily through police, the courts, the prisons. So that's, in a sense, what I was trying to capture in that passage you read.
I just want to point out, I'm not aware of any country that doesn't have a policing apparatus, including all of the countries that are social democracies in Europe and Scandinavia. I think that there's no reason to think that those two things can't go together. And in fact, there are ways in which I think they can be quite complementary. So again, I'm not clear. It sounds to me like we're talking mostly about mass incarceration as opposed to policing. So my hope would be to refocus the discussion more on the policing side of things and what can be done to get the kind of policing that I think most people would like to have.
Yeah. No, we are trying to pay attention to both your works. Your pieces in the New York Times and his book, and we're trying to make sense of both of them and use them as context for the conversation about policing. Because policing, in my opinion, does not happen in a vacuum. For example, when I was reading up on this subject, I discovered that the United States is just a country full of guns. Half the civilian, half of the guns in the world, 50% of all the guns in the possession of civilians in the world are in the United States. And so the police force has to deal with a heavily armed civilian society. So, and the other fact is, the United States spends something in the neighborhood of 1% of GDP on policing. I mean, that's a huge number. That's a force that you mentioned in one of your articles, the 700,000 law enforcement officers in the United States. Sounds to me like the size of an army, but it's not big enough, not bigger. It's two, somebody said it's 2 per 1,000 per population, it's not very high. But basically the conception I'm getting, the United States is very different from the social democratic societies that you mentioned. It's like The Guardian not long ago talked about in the first 24 days of 2015, the United States police officers in 24 days killed more people than had been killed in Wales and England over a 24-year period. This is a fact mentioned in Jill Lepore's article, The Invention of the Police, was published in the New Yorker magazine last year. So the United States is a very different country from a lot of many European countries. Would you agree?
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, I mean, so we are dealing with to be very blunt, with a very violent society. So in a way, it could be an excuse for the police to be heavily armed and militarized because they're dealing with a very violent society. Would you agree to that?
I mean, I think it depends a little bit, and Brendan's the criminologist. I think that the United States is an outlier with respect to gun violence in particular. With respect to other forms of violent crime, the United States is less of an outlier, but it's the gun violence that which the United States really stands out.
Yeah. So, so there's a difference between the United States and some other European social democratic nations. I want to go back to you mentioned Goldstein, but I was hoping that you'd mention August Volmer. The name, of course, you're nodding. So in Jill Lepore, an article, he was appointed police chief in Berkeley in 1909, and he refashioned, according to Jill Lepore, American police into an American military. He had served with the 8th Army Corps in the Philippines in 1898. 4 years, ever since Spanish-American War days, he said, I've studied military tactics and used them to good effect in rounding up crooks, he later explained. After all, we are conducting a war against the enemies of society, unquote. And this is the war on crime that Lyndon Johnson would declare in, I think, in 1965 or so. And then Joe Biden also, for many, many years, would say something close to that. In 1982, Joe Biden said in the Senate, you are in as much jeopardy in the streets as you are from a Soviet missile. And this, what this Volmer episode represents here is a lot of people come back, enter the police force from the military, and use the same tactics that they had used against other peoples in the Philippines, in Latin America, and so on. They begin to see the downtrodden in America as enemies of the state, just like Joe Biden said in 1982. And today's, Jill Lepore mentions police officers are disproportionately veterans of U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of people get recruited into the police from the military after having fought all the undesirables out there, especially in a colonial context. How would you comment on that?
Okay, so this is a complicated question to answer for me because I very much like and respect the work of a sociologist at the University of Chicago named Julian Go, who's the basis for Jill Lepore's article about August Volmer. Volmer was, again, the police chief in Berkeley, and so Berkeley isn't just kind of a random town in policing. It's kind of credited with being in the early 20th century, one of the places that helped to bring about professional policing in the U.S. in a period when, in the late 19th century, at least in northern and western cities, policing there was a high degree of corruption, and still then going forward into the 1930s, the use of the third degree in interrogation was very common. Volmer, this was a little bit before that period, Volmer decided to try to professionalize policing and was hugely influential. Started a program at UC Berkeley. One of his students was O.W. Wilson, who was a reform superintendent of policing in Chicago in the 60s, for whom Herman Goldstein was an assistant for a period. So there's an interesting connection. Yes, did Volmer import kind of elements of military-style tactics into policing in Berkeley? He did. I mean, to me, I don't think anyone with any involvement with policing would find it surprising to think that it has military influences. I mean, it is explicitly a paramilitary organization. That's not a shocking statement. I think Lepore's article, to be frank, is a fairly profound misreading of Volmer. If you actually read his work, he was as committed to the idea that police should be involved with the enterprise of social work as he was with something resembling more a military approach. And so she sort of read him as one of the foremost, kind of a forerunner of militarized policing of today, SWAT teams and so on. And that's very much a misreading of Volmer. But I think it speaks to an interesting question and something that I think you were asking before. There is this tendency now in policing discussions to sort of indict the policing enterprise by reference to its very sordid past, by connection to its connection to slave patrols, to colonialist enterprises, and so on. That kind of history is real and can't be ignored. But there's the very real question of what do you do? One of the cities I study is Longmont, Colorado, which is near Boulder. It's a city of about 100,000. I study, among other things, or I've been working with two of the domestic violence detectives there. They're catching about 50 really serious domestic violence cases a month, which is way too much for them to investigate. These are people who are, the victims are almost entirely women, and the abuse that they've often suffered is tremendous. It's a little hard for me to think about I'm very sympathetic to the theory side of things. I'm very sympathetic to the historical accounts. That all makes good sense. At the end of the day, there are people who are facing various degrees of threat and sometimes need somebody who can come and remove somebody from a situation who's threatening them. And so my question is, what can we do to get the kind of policing that we want? Policing that's both efficacious, so we certainly want that, but also, as democratic as possible. And again, I'd love to move us toward a discussion of, what some of those reforms might look like.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
On this point of the military origins of police, it's not just a matter of August Volmer and the Philippine insurrection, right, or what was called the Philippine insurrection. The orthodox version of policing, right, begins with the London Metropolitan Police, right? The London Metropolitan Police was founded by Sir Robert Peel, who was a colonial administrator in Ireland and modeled the London Metropolitan Police on the Royal Irish Constabulary, which were, a paramilitary police force, but also encompassed all functions of government. They, enforced public health measures. They collected the census. They, did everything that we associate with government, right? On this point that Neil drew, the distinction between militarized policing and social work, I do not think that is a meaningful distinction. What Volmer did in the Philippines was he was engaged in a grinding, brutal counterinsurgency campaign, right? Which often, the General David Petraeus described as armed social work, right? So, to me, the origins, the distinction between policing and warfare is not a meaningful one, and it's one that obscures the deep, practical, institutional, personal connections between policing and war making. And I would, even raise, trying to be deliberately polemical. Police is the name we give to, the war power for the oldest war in human history, and the one that most polite commentators will never mention, and that is the class war, right? So hearing Neil raise this point about domestic violence, to me is a bit much to bear. Many people do not report abuse to police, right? If you look at a victimization survey, less than half, and a victimization survey is when you ask people, have you been victimized, right? And you ask them it over a series of years. And it is a useful counterweight to official crime stats. Less than half of victimizations are reported to police. Nationwide, only a third of reported crimes are cleared, which means only a third of reported crimes result in an arrest. So this assumption that the police are good at, responding to crime and protecting people is simply untrue. It's not borne out from the data, and it doesn't reflect what policing actually do. Well, what police do, right? Policing is order maintenance. It's order maintenance in the Philippines in 1898 in, a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. It's order maintenance in the streets of Augusta, dealing with a mental health crisis. It is order maintenance. Police are not here to protect you.
I mean, I'll just respond. I'm not sure how to respond to that. It sounds like more of a rhetorical claim than a practical claim. I mean, we can talk about whether we ought to be doing more to encourage the kind of policing such that people would in fact report crimes at higher levels depending on the kind of crime. That's a whole conversation. The idea that that if somebody calls because they're being abused by their intimate partner and the police come and make an arrest or not make an arrest, but if the case is strong, do make an arrest. The idea that the person is not in some potential way protected if that person is deterred from further action or sent away such that further instances of abuse can't. I don't know how to respond. I mean, yes, that's very obviously police providing a form of protection. If somebody is literally getting beaten up by their partner, that's a very direct form of protection. I want to come back to the military point that you made earlier. You can track the percentage of police officers who have military experience. It's been falling in the same way that the level of volunteerism, the proportion of the population that's involved in the military has been falling, which is an interesting development, right? At the same time that people talk about the militarization of policing, the actual numbers of people who have law enforcement, who have military experience in law enforcement is declining. I think that among the conversations that people are having, that chiefs are having now, is what kind of person do we want going into law enforcement? This is something that Herman Goldstein was very concerned about. Do we want someone who has a sort of authoritarian mindset, or do we want someone who has a fundamentally democratic mindset? And I think some chiefs are wondering whether traditional sort of set-asides or preferences for military veterans ought to be reconsidered, whether that's that should necessarily qualify someone to be a police officer or not. So I think there are important conversations there about what those qualifications should be. But I'd like to get us to something more concrete than I feel like we're lost in a world of abstraction here.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're talking about policing in America. We're not necessarily exclusively talking about reforming the police, just basically the policing, the act of policing in America. And then, of course, the conversation includes how to reform, if there's anything to be reformed in the police culture and so on and so forth. And you do think so. You suggest, for example, 3 changes: banning pretextual stops, as one of them, in the article you published last year, requiring written consent for searches and holding supervisors accountable for the inequitable behavior of the officers could bring greater justice to our roads. Brendan, do you think that's enough?
I mean, I obviously don't think that's enough. I mean, I think that's I don't disagree with those points, but I think they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what police is and what police agencies do. I do not believe a democratically, I do not believe it is possible to have democratically accountable, scientifically managed policing, right? I think the nature of police power, and this gets back to the point about discretion, right? The nature of police power is discretionary order maintenance, right? It's not law enforcement. So I am this isn't necessarily my position. This is a position coming out of, out of a social movement, right? But if the police are good at solving crimes and preventing crimes, then let's narrow their mission down to that, right? Let's focus on those 66% of crimes that are not cleared. Let's let the police investigate reported crime, and let's develop other tools to deal with social problems. So, I am all for, things that reduce reforms that reduce the scope of policing, like the ones Neil outlined in his article on pretextual stops, right? But I don't think that's enough, and I think we need a different understanding of policing and a different understanding of of social order, right? And on this point, I would mention, Neil made the comment earlier that all these social democratic countries have police, right? Like, that is true, right? I want to go beyond social democracy, right? And I would point out, for the majority of human history, we didn't have police. We didn't have police, right? We have, those historical instances are as significant and as legitimate as, the modern ones that easily come to mind, where policing seems like just the natural way of things.
So,
I'll come back. So I just want to say, I think one way of talking about this maybe to get some ground, to find some common ground between us, is to talk about the question of jurisdiction. Like, what is it that police officers do? What is it that they should do? Volmer is an interesting guy because one of the things, there's a great book by a legal scholar on the history of traffic enforcement. And one of the things that Volmer did was to get police into the business of traffic enforcement. This was, early 20th century. Many states didn't require driver's licenses when cars were first introduced. Cars had no meaningful safety features. Roads were poorly marked. Traffic safety deaths were astronomically high, and there was no one to enforce whatever laws were. So, Volmer helped to get the police into this business. They sort of took over jurisdiction for traffic enforcement. So there's a lot of question about whether the police should continue to be involved in traffic enforcement, whether some other entity should do that. And I think one way of thinking about part of what we're talking about here is, what are the areas over which the police should continue to have jurisdiction, and what are the areas over which perhaps we want to have other agencies take charge. The traffic enforcement piece is interesting because I think there's some good evidence to suggest that when police officers are not enforcing traffic laws, we know that sadly traffic deaths go up. Nonetheless, police officers stop a lot of cars, and we know that this is in fact the number one way that citizens and police officers interact. There was a great New York Times piece about this last weekend. We know that among the many millions of cars that are stopped every year, we know that a disproportionate number of drivers are black. So are there things that can be done which is a very kind of dangerous and difficult situation? There's the use of force possibility. There's also just the sheer fact of being stopped on a regular basis because of the color of your skin, which conveys the sense of not being a full citizen. So are there reforms that can be made? Yeah, I think there are reforms that are made. And a number of cities are actually making, nothing to do with my article, of course, but a number of cities and states are currently making changes exactly along those lines. So will those produce the kinds of reforms and changes that people think? I think there's some reason to think that they might. So reform is not only possible, it's happening now. And so I think we'll have to see what the results are, but I'm optimistic.
Yeah, what I'm sensing is you have a different conception of what the police is. And what Brendan, based from what he's saying in his book, the police is part of a security system designed to protect the interest and keep the surplus populations in check. In other words, all these people who come out of jail, it's a very interesting fact that as people are coming out of jail, there's a process of decarceration, you call it, right? People are but simultaneously being subjected to a very rigorous system of surveillance and management because there are no jobs, they have no quality of life that Goldstein is talking about. So the quality of life in Brendan's reading is that of the elites who have the money to hire the police and make them work for their interests and keep all the other surplus populations in check. You seem to take a neutral position on this issue. Is that you don't seem to pay attention to the class struggles in society, the inequities, the class structures in a society, and the place of the police in such a system?
So I'll say a couple things about that. First of all, while I certainly recognize that this is a legitimate topic of conversation in debating the police, I will point out that we are now far beyond talking about the police. We're now in a full-scale debate about the future of class in America, or kind of what we want about that, which is fine. That's okay. I guess I'll point out second that it's interesting in conversations about class and policing that there's often very little conversation or a different emphasis on other institutions in society that are equally implicated in questions of class and questions of inequality. I think it's hard. I mean, if you were a fervent believer that we ought to have a classless society, then sure, I suppose it makes sense that we wouldn't have a police force. If you are a believer that some version of the broadly capitalist societies that most countries of the world have now are going to remain in place for the next foreseeable future. The question is, how are you going to maintain order, and how are you going to deal with instances of crime that occur, and how can you get police forces that are, again, maximally effective and maximally democratic? And I suppose that's where my interests lie. It's much more practical.
Well, you have two different interests. I mean, there's no position that is beyond or empty of any ideological assumptions. You know, so we all have our perspectives, our convictions, our ideologies. Sometimes they're explicit. Sometimes they're not so. But in the case of what's interesting, what interests me in your book, Brendan, is there's not a single mention of when I was a kid in Morocco, I heard very early on of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Have you heard of him? Proudhon?
Yeah.
Have you heard of him?
Yeah.
Okay, great. But he is probably one of the major theories about how property is equals theft. I mean, in terms, even Adam Smith, in some of his lectures in the early 1760s, this is what he had to say, lectures on justice, police, revenue, and arms at the University of Glasgow. Laws and government may be considered as a combination of the rich to oppress the poor. And this is Adam Smith, one of the prophets of American capitalism, and preserve to themselves the inequality of the goods which would otherwise be soon destroyed by the attacks of the poor, who, if not hindered by the government, would soon reduce the others to an equality with themselves by open violence. The government and laws hinder the poor from ever acquiring the wealth by violence, which they would otherwise exert on the rich. They tell them they must either continue poor or acquire wealth in the same manner as they, the rich, have done. And I think, one of the question of policing, I would suggest, is inextricably connected to the class structure in a society. I mean, because otherwise, who is policing whom? I mean, you began by talking about the police in ancient Greece, the notion of the police, which is civil society through debate and discussion, is for free people and so on. But police is for the slaves. So police is for the free people, police is for the slaves. And I think that or for the downtrodden or the people without the means and the people and so on. So I think it's very difficult, I would think, Neil, to extricate the question of policing from the nature of the society it is embedded. Would you?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm going to stop here. It's 7 o'clock, and I think a lot of people have a lot of questions. And please do raise your hand and go ahead. There's a lot to be said about this issue. What I find interesting in Brendan's writing and in your writing as well, because this issue of policing came to our consciousness, or came to public consciousness in a very strong way following the death of George Floyd last year and so on. But what we end up talking about here is about broader issues about class, and class is a very broader category than race. And it includes Native Americans. You know, for example, there have been many wars by the U.S. Army. You know, Jill Lepore talks about the U.S. Army as a police force, especially against Native Americans, the many wars they waged against them, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of people included in this surplus population that you mentioned in your book, which is good to know, because we in the public discourse in the newspaper, in the media, is like they treat it in a very narrow way, but it's a much broader discussion.
Have you ever called 911? Have you ever called 911?
My wife did, and now she on me. No, just kidding. No, I had a back problem. I fell, I was paralyzed in my back, and my wife said to call 911 from an ambulance, and I said, well, why are you doing that? But basically, by and large, most people's contact with the police is, I mean, it's mostly negative. I think, they get pulled over, they get a ticket, it's like he mentioned. I mean, I don't know from personal experience. I don't know many people from their personal experiences who've had positive encounters with the police, except when they get a ticket or, I don't know. I mean, it's probably you did. I don't know.
And so if, all right, fine.
Hold on one second, please, ma'am.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Hi, thank you.
On that note, you brought it up. She called 911 because you were sick and you needed health care immediately.
Yes.
So as someone who's going into the nursing workforce, who's doing clinicals currently in the state of Maine and who sees acute cases of mental illness, like you mentioned, in facilities in Sanborn and Biddeford, and who also sees just sick and violent people all over the hospitals in Portland, how would you propose to otherwise control people who are becoming, as a nation, increasingly violent and sick? Because what we have to think about as well is the American population, like you mentioned earlier, is attracted to guns. We live in a state that has lenient gun laws. With an armed populace, as someone who is not into guns, how do I know that people are conducting themselves by a code of conduct that we've all agreed to? Because it seems that America's lacking that right now. And I also see us getting increasingly worse in terms of not having a baseline value. So how could we engage with each other without a code of conduct and without an overarching body like the police force to enforce that?
Well, what I would say is that we send a powerful message to the priorities of our country are quite clear in the way we ration things like healthcare or housing, or a right to a livelihood or job. So for me, and this may seem like a big picture evasion, right? But I don't think it is, right? I want to deal with social harms on the front end. I want to prevent crime by meeting people's basic needs. Healthcare, housing, livelihood, these should be universal rights afforded to everyone on the basis of human dignity. Do not separate the so-called deserving from the undeserving. Every human being deserves a decent life. That is a revolutionary statement in a capitalist society. We do not believe that every human being deserves a decent life. We believe that if you are undeserving if you can't work for it, right? So first, I would say we need to revise the social contract around around the commons, right? Around direct access to basic needs, right? There's a lot of other issues that will, a lot of other issues in your question. What to do about guns? What to do about, meeting everyone's basic needs isn't going to resolve all social problems, and it certainly isn't going to resolve all social problems overnight. So it's not an answer to, it's not an immediate answer, but it's the right thing to do, and it's a question that we systematically refuse to engage with, right? Because we would rather endlessly accumulate private wealth, right? And ration basic needs.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you. Microphone, please.
We have one over here. Sorry, we have one right over there.
Okay. Oh,
I'm just going to ask a straightforward question. What do each of you think is would be the real effects of a true defunding the police policy if it passed and were implemented? Thank you.
So there are different versions of what that means. Certainly some advocates of defunding, want very stark cuts in policing. Others advocate more modest trims. So it's a little hard to answer the question. And it's also a little hard to answer the question because whether cuts are needed or not varies quite a bit by department. Right? We have roughly 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the U.S., perhaps 15,000 state and local agencies, 15,000 local agencies, and whether they are overfunded or underfunded varies a lot by the kind of agency you're talking about. Are there some departments where there have been problems with overtime spending, for example, or where budgets are not allocated in a maximally efficient way? Yes, there are, and those departments probably need some work. Are there other places that are severely lacking in staff and personnel? Yes, there are, and those agencies are seeing real shortages on the streets. They're seeing dramatically increased response times for serious calls, as well as for less serious calls. They're having to reduce the amount of face-to-face contact between police officers and citizens, so that police sometimes can't respond to, for example, property crimes, unless they're happening in progress. So some of those changes are quite serious. The other thing I'd point out is that there are very few cities that are now currently moving in the direction of serious defunding. Those that decided to do something along those lines after the murder of George Floyd have now mostly pulled back. And certainly the most recent election results coming out of Minneapolis suggest that broadly speaking, the public's taste for significant defunding, which I agree with the Democrats, it was always a terrible term and terrible term strategically, is small, even in deeply blue cities. So my own sense is that what it would mean would vary quite dramatically depending on the size of the cuts and the city. But I think in many places it would in fact compromise public safety.
Just one, every advocate of defunding the police I know wants to reinvest in care. So the original slogan was defund the police, invest in care, right? And the idea that I don't know anyone who recommends defunding the police and not redistributing that money elsewhere. And just one quick thing on the Minneapolis vote. Over 40% of the city voted to disband the police department and refashion it along as a Department of Public Safety. That is not insignificant, right? The abolition of slavery wouldn't have polled well in the 1850s. And when Martin Luther King was assassinated, right, he was viewed as political enemy, as public enemy number one, right? The civil rights movement was not popular at the time, right? So the fact that defunding the police and police abolition is an uphill battle doesn't mean, despite all the smart opinions of pollsters, doesn't mean it's destined to failure, and doesn't mean that it's, it should be written off, right? Because, because it's not a, an easy idea to win, right?
But it is also an interesting argument for advocates of social democracy and for democracy in general to claim that something that the populace doesn't support and for which there appears to be very little support in any nation around the world is somehow a democratic position and not an elitist one.
It's a point of political struggle.
Well, talking about funding, our VP of Finance here, our senior VP of Finance is in the room. And she always reminds us she cannot fund everything, all the requests that come to her. And now, I used to work in a maximum security prison. John told you for 3 years I taught in a maximum security prison, and I had students write papers on what it means to be in this situation and so on. So at that time, it was like in the early 90s, and the one student I remember very vividly said, he wrote in the paper, said, the state of New York spent something like, I'm just going to mention numbers just to give you a sense, like $25,000 per year on me to keep me in prison. Whereas the poverty rate for a family of four in the state of New York was something like $14,000 for family of four. So if the state were to spend more money on education and housing, it would save money, and there would be fewer people in prison. So when we talk about funding, are we talking about funding priorities for a nation? And Is that your understanding of it, or you have a different understanding of it, Neil?
You know, you won't get any argument from me about the need to increase social welfare spending in this country and the need to, you know, to bring up the social safety net. I think we are, you know, woefully underfunded in that regard, certainly in comparison to other wealthy democracies. You know, the question for me is where that money comes from. You know, one thing I've been a bit puzzled about in some of the conversations around defunding and abolition, and I will point out, by the way, that there are interesting ways in which many police officers actually support parts of the defunding and abolition agenda, not, of course, in those terms, but the idea, for example, that police officers should no longer be the ones who have primary responsibility for responding to mental health calls is something that I think most police officers would completely agree with. They don't like responding to those calls. They feel unprepared to handle them. They wish that there were mental health workers available 24/7 to respond to those calls. And so the idea of, you know, developing alternative agencies that could do that, I think, is something that would actually find a great deal of support among police officers. You know, what's always confused me is the question of, you know, why the expectation should be that, you know, we're getting the money for dramatically increasing the floor of social welfare spending from municipalities as opposed to from the federal government. I mean, it seems that to me that in most nations that are similar to ours, the bearing the costs of dealing with social welfare comes directly from the federal government and not from municipalities. And yet the idea of abolition or defunding is somehow, as Brendan was suggesting, that we take money from municipal budgets and redistribute it to social welfare. I can't imagine that the money that would be redistributed in that regard would be enough to make a sizable difference. And so, again, you won't get any pushback from me about the idea of bringing up the social welfare spending. But I don't see, again, looking at comparable countries elsewhere, why that means we need to dramatically reduce spending on policing.
Any other question? Okay, yeah, sorry.
Hi, I am a 34-year veteran law enforcement officer. 23 of those years I worked violent crimes, domestic violence, child abuse, sex crimes, and human trafficking. My question is for Brandon. Why do you believe the police, what data did you get to make you believe the police will not protect you? Did you ever ride with law enforcement maybe? I'm just wondering if, I'd like to know for myself. I've instructed in police academies before, and you were the first person I've ever heard say that the police will not protect you.
I mean, I have done ride-alongs. I did a ride-along in Camden, New Jersey. I interviewed, 82 police officers that worked in and around intelligence in, New York and New Jersey, including, in many, many of the roughest cities in those states. So when I say the data, like let's I'm happy you brought this up, right? Let's talk about white collar crime for a moment, right? Mm-hmm. You were pressing Neil on like the structural class bias of police is the way I would put it, right? So so for the past decade, there's been between 14 and 17,000 homicides a year in the United States. That's a lot, right? But there's also another source of mass death in this country we don't talk about, and that's workplace, right? 5,200 workers are killed on the job each year. 4 million people are injured. 50,000 deaths each year are attributable to occupational diseases, right? I don't want to trivialize the number of homicides, right? This is a serious problem, and there's a lot to be said about that, right? But those 50,000 deaths attributable to workplace disease that happen each year, right, they shouldn't be overshadowed, right? They're not as dramatic or as easily understood as homicide, but that doesn't mean that a person who died from cancer developed as a result of unsafe working conditions is any less of a victim than someone who was murdered or killed in a vehicular manslaughter, right? So is the corporation that puts people to work in conditions that will kill them in the long run any less guilty of homicide than the type of offender we might think, right? So I say this because, my position towards police is not a personal one, right? Like my bread is buttered by teaching students that want to be police officers, right? And the vast majority of them are like civic-minded young people, right? My point is police power. Police power is about the administration of poverty, right? It's not about the well-being of society as a whole. If it was about the well-being of society as a whole, white-collar crime would be taken as seriously as violent crime. White-collar crime is arguably, right, more destructive than violent crime. It's certainly more destructive than property crime, right? Wage theft is the biggest property crime issue in the United States, and it is totally invisible, right? That is because we do not live in a society. We live in a class-dominated social order, right? And our government exists to maintain that domination, not to maintain some kind of natural equilibrium, you know, of you know, how humans are meant to live, right? So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you for not answering my question.
Hi. So Neil, you touched on the idea that there seems to be a feeling of unpreparedness within the police force, and there wasn't really a discussion tonight about the education of the police force. And my question is kind of, what are your thoughts on the level of education that police receive, and do you feel that if there was to be a reformation on the funding that police in the police budget, should it be put towards gaining perhaps a degree or some sort of certification within psychology, social work, or something of that nature?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It was actually something that Goldstein touched on in the 70s and that people have been talking about for a long time. And I think there are different aspects of it. So the first is, you know, if you look at the average educational levels of educational attainment of police officers in the US, they've been going up. So, you know, something like 40% now have bachelor's degrees. And it's been rising at the same level of the general educational attainment of the country has been going up. So that's not entirely surprising. You know, the question is, you know, what does that education consist of? And what does police training look like? Again, there's some, you know, misconceptions that have been floating around out there. You know, how does police training in the U.S. compare to police training in other countries? In Europe, for example, you know, on some accounts, it falls dramatically short. People look at academies here. I don't know what it is in Maine. In California, for example, it's now 6 months. It was 5 months when I was doing it. And they say, well, you know, comparison to police training in Europe, which can stretch, you know, 2 years or longer, it falls far short. It's not actually an apt comparison because in the U.S., police officers also go through a process of field training, which can last another 3 or 4 months. Nonetheless, I think it's true that in many other countries that, you know, try hard to produce a form of policing that will be, you know, responsive to community needs. I think policing is more professionalized, is more closely tied, not to academia exactly, but you know, to an academic foundation for thinking about what policing is, what the police role is, the role of police in a democracy. You know, I think that one thing that we might consider doing in that regard, in addition to, you know, possibly raising educational levels requirements for law enforcement, is to think about the kinds of educations that people have. You know, so lots of people who go into law enforcement will get a degree in criminal justice. I think that's the most common major. You know, there are questions that could be raised about whether that's you know, an adequate form of preparation, in the sense that maybe you really want people who have a broader kind of liberal arts education. The challenge, of course, is that now this is a time of tremendous difficulty in many departments for recruiting new folks. So departments everywhere are really hurting. Recruitment's really challenging. Part of it is, you know, what policing looks like in the current period. Part of it is just that it's a really good labor market in general. So there's lots of other occupations that are competing for people's attention. Some of it is departments don't have, you know, as much money to offer as they might like. So getting anybody through the door who meets basic qualifications can be challenging. And so raising those qualifications can be challenging. I think, you know, one way to bridge the gap might be more programs that offer ongoing but meaningful college education to people who are currently police officers. not just kind of online programming, but for example, there are some really innovative programs that involve putting police officers in classrooms with other students to share their experiences, to talk through difficult texts and have conversations like we're having now. So I think there's a lot more that could be done, and I certainly hope that more reform effort will be put out to that into the future.
Okay, unless somebody has, oh, go ahead. More question. One last question.
We've been talking a lot about the power, and I've seen in the last few years, despite being her husband, I've seen glimmers of hope on accountability. And with a 30% success rate on solving crimes, holy cow, I know they've got a really tough job, obviously, but that isn't very accountable in my mind. If we had first of all, how are other countries around the world on their rate of solving crimes as compared to us? And then secondly, what if that number was much higher? Would we be still having the same discussion today if they were solving 60 or 70% of the crimes? I mean, they're at 30%. No logical business person's going to accept 30%.
Well, you're asking a very charged question. That can take us, that can probably lead us to a long discussion. And because crimes, the cause, what is a crime anyway in a capitalist society? Brendan would say, right? That kind of thing. And so this conversation will never end.
Well, look, I'll just be really brief about it.
Yes.
The solve rate for crimes varies a lot across the crime of crime, right? So
yes.
The solve rate and it also varies a lot across types of cities, right? So homicide rates in this country, average around homicide solve rates average around 60%. Or no, they're actually a little bit lower than that. But in some cities, they're substantially higher. In some cities, they're substantially lower. A lot of that has to do with the volume of cases that detectives are working. Some of it has to do with how much trust there is between detectives and people in the community, whether it's victims in domestic violence cases who don't want to share what's happened because they're afraid of reprisals, or whether it's people in the community who don't trust law enforcement and so don't want to give information. It also varies across types of crimes, right? So solve rates for property crimes are really low. One of my favorite books in this regard is by a journalist named Jill Leovy, a book called Ghettoside, which was a story about homicide detectives in Los Angeles. And for her, the interesting thing, or the tragic thing, is that and in Los Angeles at that time, and still across many parts of the country, solve rates for homicide cases when victims are black, on average, are substantially lower than when victims are white. And there's lots of reasons for that. But her point, in line with the claims of many criminologists, is that if solve rates were substantially higher, the chances are, in fact, high that we would bring down homicide rates, right? So I think you're exactly right. There's kind of different aspects, different sides of deterrence. One of them is how harsh is the punishment. But the other is, that doesn't matter if people aren't being arrested and successfully, tried for offenses that they've committed. So, one way to potentially, bring down crime rates while keeping, or in fact lowering punishment, would be to invest much more heavily in investigatory actions by police. And I think there's some reason to think that, at least for some forms of crime, that could be a quite effective strategy.
James?
Thanks, I couldn't resist. So I have a question for each of you. And I guess I'll ask each in turn. So Neil, we've talked about reallocating resources and that sort of thing. It seems to me that perhaps a good argument could be made for actually increasing funding for police. And what I mean is, if you look at the New York Times piece that you referenced that was published about a week ago, the common thread, they studied, I believe it was 400 traffic stops where there were officer-involved shootings of unarmed people. And they dissected these. And what they found was the common thread was, what to me it seemed like, poor training. There were mistakes, systematic mistakes that officers made, right, that cops made in those stops. And I'm sympathetic from personal experience to when you're under tremendous pressure in the heat of the moment trying to make decisions, only because I studied martial arts. And in martial arts, I ended up sparring and then ended up on the tournament circuit, actually competitively doing martial arts. And I found that it was all about the training. And I'm not talking about textbook training. I'm talking about hands-on, experiential simulation because you rely on those kinds of instincts. If we really took that seriously, it seems like what we would do with those New York Times data is we would actually increase the kinds of training, especially simulation training, in the same way that we do with our medical students and our health sciences students. We use a lot of simulation, and increasingly we use simulation as part of their training, that we do a lot more of that with police, regardless of what bachelor's degree they had. And hopefully that would then drastically reduce the number of police-involved shootings, which have already been going down, of course, but this would reduce it further. So I'd ask for your reflections on that point. Should we increase police budgets with a specific focus on more experiential and simulation training under unpredictable, high-stakes kinds of scenarios? And then, Brendan, for you, my question is, your whole premise seems to be that if we could create this utopian, classless society, that there would be no violent crime because people would have their basic needs met. And I just wonder, would you argue that if we were able to achieve that society, then in fact, that there would be no need for police? People would behave non-violently towards each other. There wouldn't, to the extent that there is any kind of property, even just like personal belongings, the shirt on my back, so to speak, there would be no theft, so there would be no need for police. And if you're really arguing that, is there any society on the planet that's ever existed that doesn't have, what we would call crime, however you want to define it, and therefore we would have no need for any kind of enforcement mechanisms? So if you could each maybe address those.
Sure. So I'll try to be brief. So first, I'll just on a brief aside, so you mentioned that the rate of officer-involved shootings has been going down. I haven't actually seen any data to support that contention. So far as I know, the rate of officer-involved shootings has remained relatively constant over the last few years. What can be done to bring down those shooting rates? There certainly are different schools of thought. I think training is part of the answer. Policy is part of the answer. There's a really great book by the criminologist Franklin Zimmering that looked at what happened in New York City when they revised their policies on shootings. And the number of police shootings just went down precipitously over a period of time. So part of it is simply revising policy. And that New York Times article, for example, suggests that in departments that prohibit shooting at moving vehicles, rates of officer-involved shooting have fallen. So that's part of it. Part of it changing police culture and thinking about what's happening in traffic stops. It's sort of reducing to some extent the level of somewhat justified paranoia, but kind of paranoia that goes around traffic stops. That's part of the answer. And training, I think, is important as well. It's interesting you mentioned martial arts. A surprisingly small number of police officers actually practice martial arts, but there's some good evidence to suggest that if that number were to increase, among the many forms of practical training, that you might actually find officers who were, far better able to engage suspects in ways that didn't involve resort to lethal violence. Of course, there's some situations in which that's not the case, but that could be part of it. I think that there's some evidence to suggest that some simulation training could be helpful. The challenge with all this is that people are always coming up with new training regimens, and some other times they're effective and sometimes they're not, and police departments are very quick to invest in them and spend a lot of money in them. The question is, are the trainings shown by evidence to be dramatically effective? And so far, from what I've seen, the evidence suggests that it's a combination of policy, culture change, and training.
So in regard to that question, I mean, one, I think an important thing that needs to be pointed out is that the way we talk about police, I think, is often quite utopian, right? So like when crime goes down, we attribute it to the police. When crime goes up, it's the police don't have enough resources. Give them more resources, right? For me, the harms that we have that exist in not just in the United States, but in all modern societies, right, are systemic, right, and they're a result of the separation of people's needs from their capacity to meet them, right? And police act as a wedge maintaining that separation, right? So, I don't believe in an end of history with the end of conflict, with perfect utopia, right? But I do think we can do better, and I think we have to do better, and to play my part, right? Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto, right? The constraints of bourgeois society are too narrow for the wealth it generates, right? We have enough. There's enough. No one should be hungry. No one should be unhoused, right? No one should go uneducated, right? The material scarcity has been conquered, right? Yet, all these perverse pathologies remain. All these terrible inequalities remain, right? I don't think it's utopian to say this needs to be resolved, right? In terms of what actually existing societies, right? I think is the most interesting example of in the world today is in the Kurdish regions of Syria, in what's called Rojava, where you have essentially what they call democratic confederalism, but what we might know better as anarchism. We have a area of 2 million people being administered from the bottom up, right, in directly democratic fashion, where matters of, say, sexual violence, for example, right, or intimate partner violence, right, are dealt with at the neighborhood level by community, they're called peace and security committees that are staffed exclusively by women and have exclusive jurisdiction over crimes against women and children, right? So I raise this example. This is not an example you can easily, import to the United States, right? And I have an article in the journal Social Justice that actually critiques an American anarchist organization called the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement that tries to take Rojava as a simple blueprint for the United States. But I do think we need to move towards a more communal form of life, where we take responsibility on the neighborhood level for the harms that exist within our community, right? So a small step here, right? And I've been involved in the fight in Portland, Maine, over getting the police out of the schools, right? Matters of juvenile discipline don't need to escalate to matters of criminal law, right? We can resolve these in-house through restorative justice practices, through things that build the school community. So this is, this one little piece, this is one step, right? And, one step leads to another, and before you know it, you have a new vantage point and you have different ideas that you couldn't conceive of before, right? So I don't have the answer that I expect you wish I had, right? But I'm not going to let the cynicism of what appears possible, right, limit what I feel is the right thing to do, the right thing to advocate for, and what could be possible, right? Again, the parameters of bourgeois society are too narrow for the wealth that it produces. We live in the wealthiest society in human history, right? In the persistence of violence and inequality is scandalous and untenable. We should all be outraged, yet we accept it as if it were, natural.
Perhaps a compromise position would be to go back to the notion of the polis, P-O-L-I-S, which is a civil society in ancient Greek concepts, and the police, P-O-L-I-C-E. And to go back to Jill Lepore's article again, she concludes by saying if the police, P-O-L-I-S, is changing, as the police changes, so will the police. So will the police. So there's a relationship between society and the police forces in that society. So you both reform in one area may lead to reform in the other, and I cannot thank you enough for this great conversation, this great exchange, and for this wonderful audience that braved the night and came to listen to this discussion. Thank you so much.